Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Reason, the certainty and truth of reason. In grasping the thought that the single individual consciousness is in itself absolute essence, consciousness has returned into itself. For the unhappy consciousness, the in itself is the beyond of itself, but its movement has resulted in positing the completely developed single individual, or the single individual that is an actual consciousness, as the negative of itself, namely, as the objective extreme. In other words, it has successfully struggled to divest itself of its being for self, and has turned it into mere being. In this movement, it has also become aware of its unity with this universal, a unity which for us no longer falls outside of it, since the superseded single individual is the universal, and which, since consciousness maintains itself in this its negativity, is present in consciousness as such as its essence. Its truth is that which appears in the syllogism, whose extremes appeared as held absolutely asunder, as the middle term which proclaims to the unchangeable consciousness that the single individual has renounced itself, and to the individual that the unchangeable is for it no longer an extreme, but is reconciled with it. This middle term is the unity directly aware of both and connecting them, and is the consciousness of their unity which it proclaims to consciousness and thereby to itself, the consciousness of the certainty of being all truth. Now that self-consciousness is reason, its hitherto a negative relation to otherness turns round into a positive relation. Up till now it has been concerned only with its independence and freedom, concerned to save and maintain itself for itself at the expense of the world or of its own actuality, both of which appeared to it as the negative of its essence. But as reason assured of itself, it is at peace with them and can endure them, for it is certain that it is self-reality. It is itself reality, or that everything actual is none other than itself. Its thinking is itself directly actuality, and thus its relationship to the latter is that of idealism. Apprehending itself in this way, it is as if the world had for it only now come into being previously. It did not understand the world, it desired it and worked on it, withdrew from it into itself, and abolished it as an existence on its own account, and its own self qua consciousness, both as consciousness of the world as essence and as consciousness of its nothingness. In thus apprehending itself, after losing the grave of its truth, after the abolition of its actuality is itself abolished, and after the singleness of consciousness is in itself absolute essence, it discovers the world as its new real world, which in its permanence holds an interest for it which previously lay only in its transiency, for the existence of the world becomes for self-consciousness its own truth and presence. It is certain of experience only itself therein. Reason is the certainty of consciousness that it is all reality. Thus does idealism express its notion, just as consciousness that comes on the scene as reason possesses that certainty directly in itself, so too idealism gives direct expression to that certainty. I am I, in the sense that the I, which is an object for me, is the sole object, is all reality and all that is present. Here the I that is object for me is not merely an empty object in general, as it is for self-consciousness as such, nor is it, as in free self-consciousness, merely an object that withdraws itself from other objects which retain their worth alongside it. On the contrary, it is for self-consciousness an object such that any other object, whatever, is a non-being. But self-consciousness is all reality, not merely for itself, but also in itself, only through becoming this reality, or rather through demonstrating itself to be such. It demonstrates itself to be this thing. It demonstrates itself to be this along the path, in which first, in the dialectic movement of meaning, perceiving and understanding, otherness as an intrinsic being vanishes. Then in the movement through the independence of consciousness, in lordship and bondage, through the conception of freedom, through the liberation that comes from skepticism and the struggle for absolute liberation by the consciousness divided against itself. Otherness, insofar as it is only for consciousness, vanishes for consciousness itself. There appeared two aspects, one after the other. One in which the essence of the true had for consciousness the determinateness of being, the other in which it had the determinateness of being only for consciousness. But the two reduced themselves to a single truth, viz. That what is, or the in itself, only is insofar as it is for consciousness. And what is for consciousness is also in itself, or has intrinsic being. The consciousness, which is this truth, has this path behind it, and has forgotten it, and comes on the scene immediately as reason. In other words, this reason, which comes immediately on the scene, appears only as the certainty of that truth. Thus it merely asserts that it is all reality, but does not itself comprehend this. For it is along that forgotten path that this immediately expressed assertion is comprehended. And equally, anyone who has not trodden the path finds this assertion incomprehensible when he hears it is in this pure formal, though he does not, as a matter of fact, make this assertion himself in a concrete shape, i.e., the assertion is implicit in the behaviour. The idealism that does not demonstrate that path but starts off with this assertion is therefore too a pure assertion which does not comprehend its own self, nor can it make itself comprehensible to others. It proclaims an immediate certainty which is confronted by other immediate certainties, which have, however, been lost on that same path. With equal right, therefore, the assertions of these other certainties took their place alongside the assertion of that certainty. Reason appeals to the self-consciousness of each and every consciousness. I am I. My object and my essence is I, and no one will deny reason this truth. But in basing itself on this appeal, reason sanctions the truth of the other certainty, viz. That there is for me an other, that I is object and essence for me, or in that I am object and essence to myself. I am only so by drawing back from the other altogether and taking my place as an actuality alongside it. Not until reason comes on the scene as a reflection from this opposite certainty does its affirmation about itself present itself, not merely as a certainty and an assertion, but as truth, and not merely alongside other truths, but as the sole truth. Its immediate appearance on the scene is the abstraction of its actual presence, the essence, and the in itself of which is the absolute notion. That is the movement which has brought it into being. Consciousness will determine its relationship to otherness or its object in various ways according to the precise stage it has reached in the development of the world spirit into self-consciousness. How it immediately finds and determines itself and its object at any time, or the way in which it is for itself, depends on what it has already become or what it already is in itself. Reason is the certainty of being all reality. This in itself, or this reality is, however, a universal, pure and simple, the pure abstraction of reality. It is the first positivity in which self-consciousness is in its own self, explicitly for itself, and I is therefore only the pure essentiality of the existent, or is the simple category. The category which formerly had the meaning of being the essentiality of the existent, and it was undetermined whether of the existent as such, or of the existent contrasted with consciousness, is now the essentiality or simple unity of the existent only as the reality that thinks. In other words, the category means this, that self-consciousness and being are the same essence, the same not through comparison, but in and for themselves. It is only the one-sided, spurious idealism that lets this unity again come on the scene as consciousness, on one side, confronted by an in itself, on the other. But now this category, or simple unity of self-consciousness and being, possesses difference in itself, for its essence is just this, to be immediately one and self-same in otherness, or in absolute difference. The difference therefore is, but is perfectly transparent, and a difference that is at the same time none. It appears as a plurality of categories, since idealism proclaims the simple unity of self-consciousness to be all reality, and immediately makes it the essence without having grasped it as the absolute negative essence. Only this has negation, determinateness, or difference within it. This second assertion is even more incomprehensible than the first, namely, that in the category there are difference or species of categories. Namely, that in the category there are differences or species of categories. The assertion as such, as also the assertion as to any specific number of species of categories, is a new assertion, which, however, itself implies that we no longer have to accept it as an assertion, for since the difference originates in the pure I, in the pure understanding itself, it is thereby made explicit that the immediacy, the making of assertion and mere finding of differences, is here given, and we begin to comprehend. But to pick up the plurality of categories again in some way or other as a welcome find, taking them, for example, from the various judgments and complacently accepting them so, is in fact to be regarded as an outrage on science. Where else should the understanding be able to demonstrate a necessity if it is unable to do so in its own self, which is pure necessity? Now, because in this way the pure essentiality of things, like their difference, belongs to reason, we can, strictly speaking, no longer talk of things at all, that is, of something which would be for consciousness merely the negative of itself. For to say that the many categories are species of the pure category means that this latter is still their genus or essence, and it is not opposed to them. But ambiguity already attaches to them, since in their plurality they possess otherness in contrast to the pure category. In fact, they contradict the pure category by such plurality, and the pure unity must supersede them in itself, thereby constituting itself a negative unity of the differences. But as negative unity, it excludes from itself both the differences as such, as well as that first immediate pure unity as such, and is a singular individual, a new category which is consciousness as exclusive. That is, consciousness for which there is an other. The singular individual is the transition of the category from its notion to an external reality. The pure schema, which is both consciousness and, since it is a singular individual and an exclusive unit, the pointing to another. Well, this other of the category is merely the other first mentioned categories, namely pure essentiality and pure difference. And in this category, that is just in the positiveness of the other, or in this other itself, consciousness is equally itself. Each of these different moments points or refers to another, but at the same time they do not attain to otherness. The pure category points to the species which pass over into the negative category, or singular individual. This latter, however, points back to them. It is itself pure consciousness which is aware in each of them of being always this clear unity with itself, but a unity which equally is referred to another, which in being has vanished, and in vanishing also comes into being again. Here we see pure consciousness posited in a twofold manner, once as the restless movement to and fro through all its moments, aware in them of anotherness, which is superseded in the act of grasping it, and again rather as the tranquil unity, certain of its own truth. For this unity, that movement is the other, while for this movement, that tranquil unity is the other, and consciousness and object alternate within these reciprocal determinations. Thus, on the one hand, consciousness finds itself moving about, searching here and there, its object being the pure inner self and essence. On the other hand, it knows itself to be the simple category, and the object is the movement of the different moments. Consciousness, however, as essence, is this whole process itself of passing out of itself as a simple category into a singular individual, into the object, and of contemplating this process in the object, nullifying the object as distinct from it, appropriating it as its own, and proclaiming itself as the certainty of being all reality, of being both itself and object. Its first declaration is only this abstract empty phrase that everything is its own, for the certainty of being all reality is at first only the pure category. This reason, which first recognizes itself in the object, finds expression in the empty idealism, which grasps reason only as it first comes on the scene, and fancies that by pointing out this pure mine of consciousness in all being, and by declaring all things to be sensations or ideas, it has demonstrated this mine of consciousness to be complete reality. It is bound, therefore, to be at the same time absolute empiricism. For in order to give filling to the empty mine, that is to get hold of difference with all its developed formations, its reason requires an extraneous impulse, in which first is to be found the multiplicity of sensation and ideas. This idealism therefore becomes the same kind of self-contradictory ambiguity as skepticism, except that while this skepticism expresses itself negatively, the former does so positively, but it fails equally with skepticism to bring together its contradictory thoughts of pure consciousness being all reality. While the extraneous impulse or sensations and ideas are equally reality, instead of bringing them together, it shifts from one to the other and is caught up in the spurious, that is, the sensuous infinite. Since reason is all reality in the sense of the abstract mind, and the other is for it something indifferent and extraneous, what is here made explicit is that kind of knowing of another by reason which we met with in the form of meaning, perceiving, and the understanding, which apprehends what is meant and what is perceived. Such a knowing is at the same time pronounced by the very principle of this idealism not to be a true knowing, for only in the unity of a perception lies the truth of knowing. The pure reason of this idealism, in order to reach this other, which is essential to it, and thus is the inner self, but which it does not have within it, is therefore thrown back by its own self, and onto that knowing which is not knowing, or what is true. In this way, it condemns itself of its own knowledge and volition to being an untrue kind of knowing, and cannot get away from meaning and perceiving, which for it have no truth. It is involved in a direct contradiction. It asserts essence to be a duality of opposed factors, the unity of a perception and equally a thing. Whether the thing is called an extraneous impulse, or an empirical or sensuous entity, or the thing in itself, it still remains in principle the same, that is, extraneous to their unity. Extraneous to that unity. This idealism is involved in this contradiction because it asserts the abstract notion of reason to be the true. Consequently, reality directly comes to be for it a reality that is just as much not that of reason, while reason is at the same time supposed to be all reality. This reason remains a restless something, and in its very searching declares that its satisfaction of finding is a sheer impossibility. Actual reason, however, is not so inconsistent as that. On the contrary, being at first only the certainty that it is all reality, it is aware in this notion that qua certainty qua I, it is not yet in truth reality, and it is impelled to raise its certainty to truth and to give filling to the empty mine.